Switch 2 has three major types of physical packaged games: a Nintendo Switch 2 exclusive game card, a Nintendo Switch 2 edition, and a GameKey card. A Switch 2 exclusive game card, as the name suggests, only runs on Switch 2. A Switch 2 edition can be played on the original Switch as well, and when you play it on Switch 2, you can play an upgraded version optimized for Switch 2. In this video, I'm going to talk about the third one, the GameKey card. A key card is a physical medium that does not contain the game data. The card only contains authentication data required to download and launch the game. And the game data itself must be downloaded via the internet. And it doesn't end once you install it. To run the game, the key card must remain inserted. In other words, it's packaged in terms of how you launch it, but closer to a download in terms of how you install it. This might feel similar to how PlayStation or Xbox uses a disc as an authentication key, but there's an important difference. Do you install the initial game data from the disc, or do you have to download it from the internet? That's where the real difference appears. In fact, because you download the game from the internet, it resembles a code in a box quite a lot. But it's also different from that. A download code is tied to an account, so once you redeem it, you can't resell it or lend it. A key card, on the other hand, ties the game to the physical card, so you can lend it to a friend and you can sell it used. To sum it up, the key card is download-based, but keeps ownership in the form of a physical medium. But you could also see it the other way around. Installing it is inconvenient like a download, and it takes up storage space. But launching it is annoying like a physical package. In other words, it can look like a structure that combines the inconveniences of both physical and digital. Especially compared to game cards that barely take up console storage, a key card requires installing the full data. And on Switch 2, where internal storage is small and expandable storage is expensive, this can feel even more burdensome. So then, why would Nintendo create this ambiguous new format called the GameKey card, when a simple two-way split like Switch, regular cartridges and digital would have been enough? The problem is, as always, money. If we look at the price structure of packaged games in Japan, the retail margin is 25%, the platform holder takes 20%, and media costs such as manufacturing and royalties take 15.5%, with the remaining 39.5% going to the publisher. But with Switch 2 meeting performance requirements means needing high-speed, high-capacity game cards, and naturally, faster and larger game cards cost more. If that happens, media costs rise, so you either raise the game's retail price or reduce the publisher's share. Nintendo can more actively use game cards for its own first-party titles because, compared to publisher titles, it has more room to absorb or adjust costs internally, including scale and volume. Even so, they're still selling packaged games at higher prices. If even the platform holder is in that situation, the burden on third parties is going to be even heavier. And it's not easy to charge more for the Switch 2 version alone when selling a multi-platform game. And unlike the Switch era, when card capacities varied, Switch 2 game cards come in a single size 64 gigabytes. From a developer's perspective, if a game is too large, releasing it as a full cartridge is costly and risky. But if the game is small, it can feel unreasonable to accept the media cost of a 64 gigabytes class card. There are also opinions saying that the key card was used because the game card's speed didn't meet the speed they needed. Nintendo has traditionally positioned itself as a mass-market console. That's why physical shelf presence at big box stores, game shops, and online retail acts as a powerful billboard. To the general public, it's not enough to see only Mario, Animal Crossing, or Pokémon on shelves. There need to be a wide variety of titles, so people recognize that console as the mainstream. And for Nintendo, having worked through the Switch era to greatly dilute the stigma that Nintendo consoles only sell Nintendo games, a reputation that persisted from the Nintendo 64 era up until before the Switch, it needed to keep encouraging third parties to release on its platform. And it likely didn't want the image of being a half console where only digital downloads were available. In other words, a mainstream console must attract not only exclusives but also a wide range of multi-platform titles, so third-party cooperation is essential. And the compromise that came out of that is the GameKey card. By shifting the game data to downloads while keeping the product in a physical package form, this becomes a compromise solution that indirectly helps third parties work around issues like manufacturing cost, capacity, and speed. The problem is that, right after launch, key cards triggered strong backlash from the packaged game buying audience. I bought a physical package, but downloading is mandatory. It takes up internal storage. Even after downloading, I still have to keep the key card inserted to play. There's no data on the card. It feels like I got the short end of the stick. And there's anxiety about the future too. If downloads get blocked someday, will I still be able to play this game? Ultimately, the key card is a structure that shifts the risks third-party publishers were carrying onto consumers, specifically in the form of downloads and storage space. So that backlash, in a way, it might be a natural outcome. But even Nintendo probably can't solve these complaints immediately, because the core problem is the unit cost of game cards. In other words, the price of chips like flash memory used for storage. And with the global AI boom, it doesn't look like semiconductor prices will easily come down, and Nintendo's options are limited. In the 1980s, Nintendo once faced a situation quite similar to today. At the time, Japan experienced a word processor and PC boom, and semiconductor supply and prices fluctuated heavily, so the game industry couldn't avoid pressure on cartridge costs. So Nintendo looked for a medium to replace ROM cartridges and focused on a magnetic disc format used for PCs at the time, the Quick Disc. And the add-on device made to use it on the Famicom was the Famicom Disk System. Discs had clear advantages by the standards of the time. They were cheaper to manufacture than cartridges, could hold more data, and most importantly, they allowed writing, meaning they were rewritable. Nintendo actively used this writing feature. They installed disc writers at retail stores and ran a service where, if users paid just 500 yen, the store would overwrite the user's disc with another game.
500円でいろんなゲームに書き換えができるのよ。
From the user's perspective, you could swap games cheaply. From the distribution side, it reduced inventory burden. And once writing became possible on a console, gameplay also changed. At the time, the main way to save progress was by using passwords. Some games implemented saving using AA batteries, but it wasn't a common approach. Nintendo strongly pushed saving through the writing feature, and for the Disk System's launch title, they prepared a large volume game that could fully use this saving functionality. That game was The Legend of Zelda: Hyrule Fantasy. By the standards of the time, it presented a massive field, 9 dungeons, and even a second playthrough, volume on a completely different level from typical Famicom games. On top of that, the Disk System also had sound expansion elements. In addition to the Famicom's base audio, it could use extra sound channels, and some games took advantage of that. After that, Nintendo released FDS-exclusive titles like Super Mario Bros. 2 and Metroid, and even went so far as to declare that, from now on, the core titles for the Famicom will be Disk System exclusives, pushing hard for a transition from ROM cartridges to discs. But ironically, after the FDS launched in 1986, events unfolded in the exact opposite direction of what Nintendo expected. As Japanese semiconductor companies grew and production exploded, the mask ROM supply issues didn't just ease, they turned into overproduction, and prices completely crashed. And ROM cartridge manufacturing technology was also advancing. With the development of special chip cartridges, adding various chips into the cartridge itself, cartridges began to surpass discs in areas like capacity, saving, and sound. As cartridges caught up to discs' advantages, discs' disadvantages became even more visible. The need to buy an extra device, low third-party participation, relatively weaker durability, slow loading speeds, these problems stacked up, and the disk system slowly faded away, handing the lead back to ROM cartridges. Nintendo's first major attempt to switch media, trying to change the medium itself in response to rising costs and supply shortages, ended up fizzling out like this. In the early 1990s, even after generations changed and the Super Famicom era began, Nintendo's physical media worries didn't end. ROM cartridges dramatically increased in capacity and functionality, and with special chips added, cartridges evolved to the point where they could assist computations the console itself struggled to handle. But as capacity grew and more chips were added, manufacturing costs rose along with them, and that naturally led to rising game prices. The issue was that, around the same time, an optical disc format capable of replacing ROM cartridges surged in popularity, the compact disc. Even the largest Super Famicom title, Tales of Fantasia, was 6 megabytes. A CD held about 650 to 700 megabytes, over 100 times more, and CD manufacturing costs were far cheaper. It was described as just a few dollars, even including pressing and packaging, making it an extremely attractive medium compared to cartridges. So companies like Sega and NEC began attempting a media transition from the late 1980s into the early 1990s by adding CD expansion devices to existing consoles. Nintendo also showed interest in CDs around the same time, and tried to push a CD add-on for the Super Famicom in collaboration with Sony and Philips, but Nintendo quickly abandoned the partnership. It fell through, and that decision would later return as an enormous butterfly effect. Of course, Nintendo didn't only insist on ROM cartridges. It released a Super Famicom expansion device that almost seemed to look beyond physical media entirely, the Satellaview. It was a remarkably ahead of its time attempt, downloading games via satellite data broadcast and distributing various content linked to broadcasts. But because the service was limited to Japan and the sales approach was passive, it seems less like an aggressive commitment to a media transition and more like an experiment. Satellaview gradually lost momentum due to limited accessibility and Nintendo's shifts in its main console focus, and the service ended in 2005, years after it began. After the partnership with Nintendo fell through, Sony launched the PlayStation on its own, marking its first step into the console gaming market. Sega also released the Sega Saturn, the successor to the Genesis. Both consoles were next-generation systems using CDs as physical media, and the Super Famicom now faced the CD-based next generation head-on. And here, an important scene appears. The Super Famicom wasn't a system that simply got cleanly crushed by CDs and ended. As it entered its later years, games started coming out one after another that made you think, wait, this is possible on a cartridge? They forced the console's limits upward through special chips and development know-how, and they held out against the CD generation in presentation and content volume. From that experience, Nintendo probably thought something like this: media isn't everything. In the end, fun wins. And then, in 1996, Nintendo finally releases its next-generation console, the Nintendo 64. At the time, the keywords for console games were clear: multimedia and 3D. CD-based consoles like PlayStation and Saturn strongly carried the image of multimedia devices. They could play audio CDs, and through certain models or expansion support, they could also play video formats like video CD. Within games, high-quality audio, voice, and full-motion video came to be seen almost like symbols of a new era. But the Nintendo 64 made a completely different choice. It adopted ROM cartridges once again. ROM cartridges also had clear advantages. Fast loading speeds and strong durability have always been long-standing strengths of cartridges. And if you don't put mechanical parts like a CD drive into the console, it's also advantageous for lowering hardware manufacturing costs. The problem is that the storage capacity is too small. Nintendo 64 cartridges went up to 64 megabytes, but compared to CD-ROM, even at the maximum, that's less than 1/10. With that limited capacity, large data presentation like full-motion video becomes difficult from the design stage. Nintendo, instead of competing in multimedia, focuses on 3D. At the time, many 3D games became 3D only in graphics, while camera, controls, and level design failed to follow, often making play feel worse. Nintendo presented the grammar of making 3D games: how to move a character in 3D space, how to handle the camera, how to make play flow naturally, through Super Mario 64, and then completed it with The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. What matters isn't multimedia, it's fun. Nintendo tried to prove that through craftsmanship and completeness. But third parties thought differently. Third-party studios that were already dissatisfied with Nintendo's coercive policies, such as strict approval structures, volume control, and risk shifting, were considering their options as Sony approached them with aggressive marketing and unusually favorable terms. Square, a JRPG powerhouse and longtime Nintendo partner, announced that the newest Final Fantasy would be released as a PlayStation exclusive. Square aimed for a more cinematic presentation in Final Fantasy VII, using full-motion video and seamless transitions between video and gameplay, and concluded that it wasn't realistically feasible on a cartridge-based system. There are multiple reasons, but in the end, the biggest wall was capacity. Starting with Square, the trend of Japanese developers leaving Nintendo accelerated. Even studios that had no choice but to release on Nintendo hardware, despite Nintendo's coercive third-party policies, chose Sony, which offered better terms and held higher console market share, and Nintendo began to be sidelined. The Nintendo 64 hardware itself also had problems. It had a complex structure and a demanding development environment, often being criticized as difficult to develop for. Even veteran developers like Namco and Konami expressed how hard it was, and even games ported to Nintendo 64 sometimes looked worse despite better raw performance because of design missteps and the small ROM cartridge capacity. Nintendo also released a disc add-on, the 64DD, to address its lack of capacity. The 64DD used a rewritable, magnetic 64 megabytes class disc to supplement capacity, included ambitious ideas like using and sharing user data in games, and even had internet connectivity in mind. But it didn't launch until late 1999 in Japan, and by then Sony was already dominating the market. With Nintendo 64 underperforming in Japan and marketing even more passive than Satellaview, it quietly disappeared. From this period, the impression that Nintendo hardware only sells Nintendo games became strong for nearly 20 years, and Nintendo handed the throne of home consoles to Sony, the company that aggressively used CDs that Nintendo had once abandoned. Entering the 21st century, Nintendo finally switches its home console physical media from ROM cartridges to optical discs. By then, competitors had already moved past CDs to DVDs with even more capacity, and ROM cartridges could no longer compete head-on. The GameCube adopted a 3-inch mini DVD-based optical disc. Its capacity was about 1.46 gigabytes, smaller than other consoles' DVDs, but within Nintendo's own history, it represented the largest jump in capacity ever. Nintendo tried to make up for the previous generation's mistakes by improving most of the issues pointed out with Nintendo 64, but at this point the PlayStation 2 was already dominating the market, and in North America the Xbox was rising as a new powerhouse. Unlike the Super Famicom era, the market leadership had completely shifted. In that situation, console performance and storage capacity meant nothing, and from here, Nintendo steps back from the performance race and focuses on gameplay originality. Afterward, through the Wii and Wii U eras, Nintendo continued using optical discs, so at least when it came to physical media, there was no major controversy. But with the Wii U's commercial failure, Nintendo sought change once again. Nintendo released the Switch, a hybrid device built on a handheld base but able to connect naturally to a TV. Because the Switch could be used as a handheld, optical media wasn't possible, so Nintendo returned once again to ROM cartridges. In fact, switching to optical media with the GameCube didn't completely end Nintendo's ROM cartridge lineage. Unlike the home console market, Nintendo remained dominant in handhelds, and ROM cartridges, due to size and stability, fit handheld devices better than optical media. So they continued to be used and continue to evolve in handheld systems. Technically, it had shifted from the old mask ROM method to flash-based ROM, the same family used in SD cards, greatly improving issues like small capacity and production risk. Because the Switch was also perceived as an extension of handhelds, switching back to ROM cartridges wasn't seen negatively. At that time, it was considered normal that optical media upgraded alongside each new generation of competing consoles. Games were installed fully to internal storage, physical media was used only for authentication, and digital downloads were already active, so the importance of physical media had weakened to some degree. In fact, the Switch's ROM cartridges, which could run immediately when inserted without installation, looked even more appealing. Nintendo enjoyed a successful era with the Switch, and now with Switch 2, it's facing physical media supply difficulties for the first time in a long while. This time, Nintendo preemptively responded by creating a new media approach, the GameKey Card. To be honest, back when I was making this video, my view of key cards was negative. I think many of you watching this video probably think the same thing. But recently, I heard an interesting piece of news. I heard that Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade, released on Switch 2, has been repeatedly selling out at major retail stores in North America. I assumed user dislike toward keycards was strong and that sales would be negative compared to game cards, so this is an unexpected outcome. Of course, FF7 is a pretty large game in terms of file size, so it was generally seen as somewhat understandable for it to be released as a keycard. And above all, because the price was cheap compared to the game's quality, it's a bit too quick to conclude that complaints about keycards are only a tiny minority, or that public perception of keycards has fully turned. Still, it would definitely have helped spread the feeling of, once you actually use it, it's not that different, about a medium that people have very strong likes and dislikes toward. It's also kind of interesting that the remake of a game that drove the point home 30 years ago, that Nintendo's physical media choice was wrong, is now driving sellouts for Nintendo's newly introduced media. And there is also the case of Pokémon Pokopia, a title that, despite being released as a game keycard, still caused widespread physical shortages across multiple countries and even helped drive console sales. At this point, it does make me wonder whether, as long as the game itself is good enough, it can sell well regardless of whether it is a game keycard or not. Even so, it is still very disappointing that, with the arrival of game keycards, it is no longer possible to buy a wide range of Switch 2 titles as fully self-contained physical game card packages. Nintendo tried to switch media to face unstable semiconductor supply, and even tried attaching add-ons to overcome capacity limits. And this time, to reduce manufacturing costs, it created a physical medium with no game data on it. Nintendo's 40-year dilemma, something that felt like it should have ended by now, is still not over. Will Nintendo keep pushing this new compromise? Will it present another solution? Or will the semiconductor problem disappear like a lie, and everything somehow work out? How will Nintendo's current dilemma end? This has been G-Note, taking keycards as an excuse to ramble a bit about the past. Thank you for watching.